This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Even if you're a newbie in the humanitarian aid and development community, I'm willing to bet you've heard about cash. And by cash, I mean the very much growing interest and support for providing assistance to those in need by giving them cash. The theory is simple. People in need of help, especially in situations of poverty and emergencies, know the specifics of their situation better than anyone else, and cash provides them the best tool to getting those needs met quickly. My guest for the 119th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast is no newcomer to the cash discussion. Paul Niehaus is a co-founder and president of GiveDirectly, which is currently the top-rated nonprofit of GiveWell and ranked among the 25 most audacious companies by Inc. magazine and 10 most innovative companies in finance by Fast Company. GiveDirectly is a recognized leader in the use of modern technology to transfer funds directly to the extreme poor and in the use of rigorous scientific methods to document its impact. I spoke with Paul in San Diego. And hey, if you like what you're hearing, please take a moment to open up iTunes or whatever your podcast app is and click on subscribe so that you get the podcast every week without even thinking about it. And also consider giving the show a rating, please, because it really does help boost us up and let other people know about it. And finally, please consider sharing this episode or the podcast in general on Facebook or Twitter to help others get in on making aid and development better. Thanks. Hello, Paul. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me on.
Where do we find you sitting today? We're recording this in late July 2016.
Oh, yeah. I am sitting by myself in a little room here in San Diego and thinking about my colleagues all around the world and the great stuff they're up to today.
Nice. You are the co-founder of an organization called GiveDirectly, which is basically trying to break some financial models out there about how we deliver assistance to people in need. Why don't we start by just, tell us about the organization.
I think we have, in terms of breaking models, look, I think we have a tremendous opportunity to modernize the way a lot of our anti-poverty works globally. And so GiveDirectly sort of was founded reflecting that and reflecting two things that we saw happening that we think create this tremendous opportunity. One was it was around the time that we first started to generate experimental evidence of the impact of different things we do. That wasn't really done much until around 2000 or so, and then it started to pick up when Michael and the other co-founders and I were in grad school. And so an incredibly exciting time continues to be, right? Lots of learning, things that we thought would work that don't, things that we thought wouldn't work that did. But one very clear theme in all of that was that simply giving money to poor people actually worked a lot better than anyone had, I think, anticipated before that. So that was one trend. And then the second is everything that's happening with last mile payments technologies in the emerging markets. And there's an enormous amount of work to be done. But the bottom line is I think that we're soon going to be in a world where we can pay anyone, anytime, anywhere. And so the combination of those two things, I think, just opens up a lot of really exciting opportunities that didn't exist before. And that's what GiveDirectly is trying to do.
Nice. Well, then just take me through the model in brief. Someone shows up at GiveDirectly's website, basically says, yeah, hey, I'd like to help poor people, throws a little, enters their credit card information, and then you send cash to people randomly? Or what goes on there? Like, give us a typical scenario.
Yeah, I really think there are two models, and I hope we could sort of talk through each of them a little bit because I think they're quite different. For the retail donor, for somebody like you or me, yeah, that's right. You go to the website and you would first see a bunch of numbers and not many pictures. Maybe, I'm not sure if we have any pictures up there right now. So
you have a refreshingly sparse website.
we try to be zen and we try to be quantitative. So hopefully you'd be able to understand exactly what will happen when you put $1 into our website, which is that it will go, through mobile money into the hands of someone extremely poor in East Africa. And hopefully you'd also be able to quickly find access to all, a summary of everything that we know from rigorous experimental testing of what we think will happen when you do that, so that you can get a very clear sense of the cost effectiveness of what you're going to do. So that would be the experience if you're like you or me, sort of an ordinary donor. And actually, that's initially who we set up GiveDirectly for, because when co-founders and I were in grad school, we were literally trying to figure out what we wanted to do with our own money, and came across this evidence and decided this was something that we wanted to be able to give to, and just found that there was no way to do it. And so that was the genesis of GiveDirectly. But I think there's also a second experience, which we're really excited about, and that's for people who are working in some of the big established aid organizations and funders. And there the experience is, you're reading everything that's being said and done about cash transfers. It's something that your organization is doing a bit of or thinking about doing a bit of, but Obviously, sort of anything new is risky, uncertain, change is slow. And so you reach out to us and say, we'd like to do something on cash transfers, or we'd like, considering cash transfers, but we're not sure how it compares to what we currently do. And we'd like to do some testing. And then, we have the opportunity to sit down and talk about how we could work together. And so we're doing some really exciting experimental projects with some of the bigger institutional funders now, where we do that impact evaluation together with them to help them think through how cash transfers are going to fit into their portfolio, and also just to provoke the conversation internally for them.
So not to spark sort of, your competitive analysis or anything like that, but give me the one sentence or the thought behind how is this different than a Kiva?
Well, I think a lot of dimensions to that, but the simplest thing is that Kiva is primarily a marketing organization, right? So what they do is raise capital, which they then lend out to MFIs working overseas. And so what they've really specialized in, and I think been reasonably effective at, is, kind of encouraging people to give or to lend. GiveDirectly is primarily a field organization. So we have about 200 people, and almost all of that headcount is on the ground in East Africa. And then we have a very minimal sort of fundraising operation, marketing operation. You mentioned the website's quite sparse. And, we're starting to grow that out, but kind of our roots are really in the field. That's the first difference. And then the second big difference is obviously that, they're providing capital for loans, and we're providing capital for grants. And I think that there is a role for both, but I think it's also fair to say that the evidence we have so far is overwhelmingly positive on grants and has been pretty mixed for loans. Kind of, it isn't quite what we had hoped and what proponents of the microfinance or micro-lending movement had promoted. And so we're doing a bit of head scratching right now about why that is. So I think those are the two key differences.
Okay, thanks. So take me back. You've mentioned a couple of times that this is something you and your co-founders started in grad school. We're interested in talking about how we're breaking models in the aid business, in the humanitarian business, and how innovation actually happens. So you're sitting there in grad school with your co-founders and, you're having coffee or beer or whatever. So one day, and one of you is like, hey, let's just give money to the poor. Like, take us through what was was it a slow burn to get to this idea, or was it an aha moment, or how did that get started?
Yeah. Well, it's a combination of things, and I don't think any great thing ever sort of happens in an instant. And obviously, really, the bulk of the work has been the work ever since then, right? It's all the hard work that my co-founders and all the people we work with have done.
Sure, the back of the napkins, that's the great thing, and then it's everything you do after it, right?
Totally right. So, but I mean, the sequence of things I think that we realized, just to walk through that, were I think the first was this understanding that as we did these experimental tests of cash transfers over and over again around the world, different contexts. You're seeing people do different things with the money. So some people are going to spend on education. Some people are going to invest in businesses. Some people, it's food, right? They're literally starving. And so it's going to be different in every context, but it was overwhelmingly positive across the board. Right? You just weren't seeing this evidence of people blowing the money on alcohol or tobacco as many had feared. And so that was the first point. I think that got us thinking about it. But then the thing that really sparked it was starting to meet some of the people working in last mile payments. And I remember specifically at the time I was working on anti-corruption in India, and still do. But we met with some people who were working on ways of cutting out corruption in some of India's social programs. And we met with some people who were trying to extend banking into the rural areas. And I think they had a model. It was a kind of a funny model. I think theirs was like a mobile ATM on the back of a motorcycle. It was like a guy would drive out into the village and process transactions and then come back and sync up at the branch bank at the end of the day. But, we started talking and saying maybe this could cut out corruption in some of these public programs. And then at some point, it just hits you that, wait a minute, this guy has created bank accounts for some of the poorest people on the planet, and there's nothing that would stop you or me from putting money directly into them. And that seems like an incredibly exciting opportunity. And so we went from there and discovered that, the same thing is happening in different places, with mobile money in East Africa and so forth. So that was the second big step. And then the third one was talking to some existing NGOs to find out if they would consider offering that as a service to us. So we didn't start with the view of let's put in the blood, sweat, and tears to build a new organization. We started with, would somebody let us give this way? It was interesting because, a lot of people do cash transfer programming now. It's certainly on the upswing. But I think it was also clear in some of these conversations that it would, be perceived as a bit of a threat to let people make that, donors make that choice because, fundamentally what we do in the aid business is we allocate capital, right? We kind of make money decisions on behalf of the poor. And this, this opportunity does question that. Should we always be the ones making those decisions?
Wow, you just opened a whole bunch of cans there. That's fantastic. So, but taking back through the genesis, you went to these NGOs. You had this idea. You sort of solidified it. You went to some NGOs. And then what was the decision to then go it on your own? I mean, ultimately, you didn't find an opportunity with the organizations that you worked with that was satisfying, obviously. But, I've been doing some research, on your site and those types of things. You've got backing, you've got funding. Did you go out and you had to pitch and, get that thing, or did you bootstrap it at first, or what happened?
Yeah, well, initially the ambition was quite modest. It was to create this as something that we ourselves and friends and family could use. And so for the first couple of years, that's all it was. It was literally, I think, my co-founder, Michael, Rohit, Jeremy, going over to Kenya, spending time walking around, finding people, figuring out, how do you get people enrolled for M-Pesa? And then once you do that, how do we upload spreadsheets into their website? Just sorting out all those nuts and bolts. And I think that in 2011, we got to the point where we felt pretty comfortable in the process, confident that we understood what we were doing enough to open it up to others and said, this still doesn't exist. It's kind of crazy that this is feasible, and yet there's no way for donors to give this way. And that ought to be an option. And so in 2011, we opened it up with a website and made it public and let anybody donate. And so around that time, we also first started talking to some of the bigger funders and foundations and saying, we're thinking about taking a serious swing at that thing. And those were fascinating conversations. I mean, if you look at where the dialogue is today, the UN Secretary General is saying that cash should be the default. The World Humanitarian Summit readout says we should do more cash. Even Parliament in the UK has put pressure on DFID to do more cash transfers. Back then, totally different conversations. We had people tell us that we were crazy. People tell us that we were on drugs. It was slow going initially.
Here you are 5 years later, after you sort of kicked it off. What's the next 5 years look like? You've got a site, you're starting to transfer, you've obviously been transferred a lot of money, you're starting to talk to bigger organizations. Where does it go from here?
Well, there's a long way to go. I mean, I've described sort of what the rhetoric sounds like now. And certainly we're now all talking about, okay, cash is going to play an important role. How big of a role? What should that role be? If you look at the numbers, it's still pretty small. So, the numbers we have, I think DFID has estimated that about 2% of their spending is on cash transfers. Pretty negligible at USAID, although they don't report it out. About 5% at most of humanitarian spending is on cash transfers. And so, those numbers are still really small. So I think the first thing in the next 5 years is, how do we get those numbers bigger? And how do we define the boundaries and start, having an intelligent way to talk about when is cash the right solution versus, when can we actually do better than cash? Like, when are we actually in a better position to decide on behalf of the poor than they are to decide for themselves? Because, to me, that's a high bar. I think that you should really have to justify that. And there will be times when it's true. There are things, vaccines aren't going to discover themselves. Roads are not going to build themselves just because poor people have more money in their hands. But the burden of proof should really be on us, I think, in the aid sector to kind of make that argument that we can do better. And rather not on the poor to kind of argue that they should be the ones spending the money. So I think that's the first thing, is where do those numbers move? And then the other thing that we're really excited about for individual donors like us is creating a more honest connection, I think, between donors and recipients. And there's been movement in this direction. You can sites like Kiva where you can see photographs and read the stories of people. I think the thing that would really excite us is to have a completely unfiltered, honest conversation between donors and recipients that would give donors an accurate view of what life is like for these people. Because I think one of the big challenges is that poor people are constantly being marketed or spun to fit a narrative that fundraisers want to use, whether that narrative is the victim of a disaster, someone who's suffering in a crisis, or the sort of stereotypical woman with a business idea that you might want to invest in. And obviously the truth is that none of these things accurately describe the kind of incredible, rich panoply of life that's out there. And I think it would be, one of the things that's incredible when we look at our internal data is just the variety of things that people want to do with their transfers, right? The variety of challenges that they're dealing with. People are all different, and it would be great if we could get that richness across.
Okay, so at the risk of committing the same crime, do you have one or two success stories that your team holds up or puts in front of potential other partners and those type that you think are especially interesting?
There are some amazing ones. We're really circumspect about communicating those because it is such a norm and such a mistake, right, to sort of present these stories and then claim that they are representative of what happens. I think there are thoughtful ways of telling stories where you tell and then provide some context. Kind of here's what the data say. This person bought a motorcycle and set up a transport business. You should know that about 5% of our recipients do that, for example. But so I think that's how we'll handle it. But to give you a sense of some of the variety, we've had people who have used the transfers to buy a motorcycle. We've had a lot of people use transfers to buy livestock. A lot of people use transfers to invest in housing. And then you have wild things like one person used transfers to buy musical instruments and started a band, and they recorded a song about GiveDirectly, and the song is now on our website, and the band now tours around Western Kenya. So all kinds of things like that.
How'd you choose Kenya?
We were looking for two things. We were looking for extreme poverty, and we were looking for access to mobile payments. And Kenya was just such a clear leader, early on in mobile payments with M-Pesa that it was a pretty easy choice. And then, of course, since then, we've moved out. We're in Uganda as well. We're in Rwanda and looking at another set of countries this year. So we've moved on from then. But Kenya was a fairly straightforward early choice.
Now, over the sort of the arc of the development of GiveDirectly and your continued evolution, what are some of the bigger disruptions that you've seen or that you've had to incorporate in your model? I'm just thinking potentially when you guys were starting this, the iPhone didn't exist, smartphones weren't there. But now we're seeing feature phones in the very, darkest corners of or the furthest reaches of every country, right? So what's been breaking your model and how have you had to change?
Yeah, I think it's been, in terms of the technology and the tools, it's been a bit more incremental. I think we've been collecting data digitally on Android devices essentially from the start. We've been integrating with these mobile payments platforms from the start. We now do that through a separate venture called Segovia, which Michael and I started, which provides that interface and integration with payments providers across Africa and other parts of the developing world. So that's been one important innovation or disruption, I guess, in sort of our thinking about how to organize this. And also, what can we do to help other people who are looking to get into cash transfers out beyond GiveDirectly to make it easier for them. So there's the Segovia piece. But I think most of the innovation and disruption, if you will, is much more day-to-day nuts and boltsy type things like what's the management structure? How do we design compensation for our field teams to make sure that people who do high-quality work out in these remote villages get rewarded for it? How do we measure performance? Those kinds of things. That's where I think there's constant change and progress.
Is that where you focus most of your time? Are you mostly on the analytical side these days, or what's your day-to-day focus in the company?
It's a mix of internal and external. I think, our goals for the year are to, move more than double the money that we've ever moved before, to be ready next year to move double that again. So to continue growing quickly, to deliver on this basic income project that I mentioned earlier, which we're incredibly excited about. We think it's an important idea that needs to be tested and hasn't been tested. And then to grow our partnerships with institutional funders. And help them learn more about cash transfers and figure out and talk about what role they should be playing in their portfolios. So we have goals across all of these things, and my day-to-day it reflects some mix of those things, and I try to do the things that I can do most effectively from here where I sit.
The thing that just dawned on me is that you just said you want to double the amount of transactions, double the amount of funds that you want to move. Are banks getting worried? Are there regulatory issues that you've got to deal with, or are you becoming a bank essentially?
It's an interesting question. We're not. The regulatory issues are faced primarily by the payments providers, by the M-Pesas, the MTNs, the banks, those guys who are the ones who actually deliver the payment to the beneficiary. And so they're the ones who have to think about know your customer regulation, things like that, all of that. There are things we can do to help facilitate that, to kind of organize the process of registering people for M-Pesa, for a bank account, and make sure that information gets provided. So a lot of what we do is managing that process to help make sure it goes smoothly.
Interesting. So in effect, you kind of are a subcontractor. I'm just wondering what one of the mobile providers in Africa or Kenya or Uganda or whatever, will they wake up one day and be like, hey, wait a second, we can do this and take your business away from you? Or that's not really on the table right now?
It's interesting. And first I'd say we'd always welcome competition. If somebody else can do what we do better, that would be great. I haven't seen interest from most of them in doing this yet, but who knows? I think that the important point here, which is often neglected, is that the work of going out and finding people who meet some definition of poor, some eligibility criteria, and then auditing that and making sure that those people really are the people that you think they are, and not just the cousins of the guy who went out and did the field work, and then getting those people plugged into the financial system, which means where can they go to get the money, getting the paperwork in, all of that stuff. And then following up and making sure the money actually reached them, and did they have to pay a bribe, and how much time did it take? Are there ways we can bring down those costs? It's an enormous logistical exercise. And I think what you've seen is, this is what a lot of global NGOs are working very hard on, where they do cash transfer programming. And it's where a lot of governments have really struggled. So the government of India, for example, has a headline push to move towards more direct benefit transfer, more digital transfer. But where they've been trying to roll this out, they've hit these real problems that you get 60% or so of people signed up, and then the other 40%, it's just not working. And what do you do? Because you can't alienate 40% of your voters. So it's hard, and I think that's kind of the core of the challenge. And the question is, who in the value chain does that hard work?
Well, speaking of hard work, you've just described at least 3 or 4 of fairly large roadblocks to getting into this type of work that you've solved so far, and other NGOs have you described have solved. Are there any other particular specific challenges to this type of cash transfer business that you'd like to highlight, or you think really stick out that either you weren't expecting, or maybe you were expecting, but then you had to sort of find a creative solution for?
I mean, I think by far the number one challenge has been perception, right? We've all heard the stories that you give people money, they're going to get drunk. We've all heard these sort of slogans like, teach a man to fish versus give a man to fish, which are, sort of not a very helpful way to actually structure decision making. But a lot of, we've heard them, and we often still slip into thinking in those terms. So I think by far that is the number one challenge. It's actually getting together, looking at the evidence, what do the data actually say, and then making decisions based on that rather than on these slogans. I think the other challenges have been the typical challenges of building a good organization, right? It's hiring great people. How do you find talent? How do you compensate people? And setting good processes in place.
At what point is this going to be? I mean, you mentioned it's the World Humanitarian Summit. This is a key issue. The UN is looking at this. I know cash transfers have been on the agenda. At what point does this turn into like a sort of a standard operation that's going into every proposal, that an NGO is filing, or is it still? Are people still figuring it out, basically?
Yeah, I mean, by the numbers, we're absolutely still in the figuring it out phase, right? And I sort of shared some of those earlier. It's, the low single digits in terms of percentage of funding that's going to cash transfers at any of these big, the big institutional funders. So, we're not there yet. And I think that change in these kinds of things often does happen slowly. And sometimes the change is generational, right? It's a new generation of people who get into the industry, who are comfortable with a new set of tools or been trained in a new way of thinking. And those are the people who really champion it. Now, I do think that there's the possibility of faster change here because the evidence has just been so overwhelming, and it's new, right? It didn't exist until about a decade ago. So we're in the process of digesting this new body of data that suggests that we can do things differently and more efficiently than we did in the past. So I think that's the real hope, but who knows?
How do you get paid, and how do you pay your staff? I noticed on your site, you put an efficiency scale up there about how much of the money is going directly to the recipients, how much you keep. Are you taking a piece of transactions? Are you donor funded right now to continue to support scale, or how does that work?
Yeah, so our model is very simple. It costs us about 10 cents on the dollar to kind of put money into people's hands, and that's the fully loaded cost. It's everything from the field enumerator who's out there in the villages locating to this person, the management structure that they're reporting into in Uganda, let's say, some share of the office space, the equipment costs, and then all the way back to New York, right? The bookkeeping systems that are supporting that, the sort of fees that were incurred to recruit the people who are managing the bookkeeping system, sort of all of that gets priced in. So, we charge people our fully loaded cost, and right now we're doing about 98, 91%, which is, we think is great and we're really excited about.
Are you fully sustainable right now?
Well, you'd have to tell me what you mean by sustainable. But I mean, in the sense that, we think we can handle a lot of money at that and continue to deliver at that rate, that efficiency rate. Yeah, absolutely.
Does your model ultimately, because it's not, it's a giving model, it's not a lending model, it requires a constant feeding. So does that 10 cents also build in the constant marketing and sort of outreach that needs to happen in order to continue to get those funds?
Well, I mean, I'd say yeah and no. I mean, it's very unsustainable in the sense that if nobody gave money to GiveDirectly next year, then GiveDirectly wouldn't exist anymore. That's also fine from our point of view. I mean, it wouldn't be fine. We don't want that to happen. But it's fine in the sense that all the money that we're giving out this year is going to get into the hands of poor people, and they're going to be put it to use. And the evidence we have is that there are going to be some great long-term impacts of that, right? There's evidence, where sort of 4 years out from getting cash transfers, people are earning, 40% more, or 80% more on every dollar they received. There are other channels through health and education that have been documented. So, the point here is getting the capital into the hands of the poor people and letting them put it to work, more so than creating a sustained GiveDirectly that has to continue to exist in order for any of this to have been of value. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. We preach a lot about that here and other people have preached a lot about, consultants needing to work themselves out of a job, NGOs needing to work themselves out of a job. And I think that's essentially the point of all this work that we're doing. That sort of takes me to another thought, though. You've described a lot about the infrastructure that's in place in order to make this not only feasible, but legitimate, right? The going and finding the extremely poor, making sure the money gets there, being able to audit that, etc. What's the scale of GiveDirectly look like then? Because obviously the first perception is, hey, here's a website, I put my money in, and you send that to somebody's mobile phone, poof, it works. But it sounds like you've got a whole lot of infrastructure underneath that. Does the model scale as big as you want?
Yeah, so we'll move about $50 million this year in East Africa. That's, around the scale of a typical large government public sector program in that area. So it's pretty meaningful. We don't promote that number a whole bunch because I think what you should care about as a donor isn't how big is GiveDirectly, but like what's going to happen to my dollar if I put a dollar in, right? That's kind of the relevant question. And so that's what we focus on when you come to the website. But that's where we're at. And as I said, planning to be ready to double again next year.
I'm thinking, let's just say you move to India, you move to Southeast Asia, you move to other parts of the world. The same sort of infrastructure model would be in place. It's not something where you found other ways to reduce the amount of sort of on the ground, boots on the ground types of things. You have your model and you like it, and that's what you would take to other places.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the core decisions that we made was to be vertically integrated, meaning that we take full responsibility all the way from receiving a dollar from a donor through to delivery into the hands of a recipient, as opposed to trying to outsource some of that stuff to a local partner, to somebody else. And, look, I think there are pros and cons, but like my general perspective is that the sort of many steps in the supply chain where one organization subcontracts to another just makes it really hard to have accountability and really hard to kind of trace through and figure out the cost effectiveness of what you're doing. So that's right. We have our sort of fully vertically integrated model, and we'd set that up again in another country if we went there today.
Who do you listen to? Who are you paying attention to? Are there others in the cash transfer business that you pay attention to? Blogs, publications, other things like that, where you look for inspiration or you look for good ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are really two kind of broad areas where we try to keep close track. One is what's happening with the evidence. And, Michael and I and the other co-founders come out of an academic background. We were doing our PhDs when we started. And so we stay plugged in and sort of are in conversation with the research community about the impact evaluation that's happening. And, my sense there broadly is that the research on cash transfers has now moved from, do people blow it, which we've sort of established as no, to a much more nuanced question, which is sort of when is this going to have the biggest and the longest term impacts, for what kinds of people, how do we structure the transfers, those kinds of things. And so that's exciting, and I expect we'll see a lot of development, and we're involved in some of those conversations about setting up the studies. The basic income trial that I mentioned earlier is one example where we're going to test for the very first time, what is the impact of guaranteeing for over a decade that someone will have enough money to meet their most basic needs. Right? That seems like a pretty fundamental question, right? Like how is life
absolutely
different? Like how is life different when your basic needs are going to be met? And yet nowhere in the world have we ever tested that sort of rigorously and at a full scale, right? So there's just an enormous amount of low-hanging fruit here of learning to be done. So that's one conversation that we're paying attention to. And I think the other is the political climate for aid, which sort of obviously shapes everything that we're then able to do in the sector. So, who's going to win in the U.S., obviously? What will Patel do now at DFID, the new Secretary for International Development in the U.K.? Tracking things like that and understanding how that creates opportunities for workers in those, for folks in those organizations, and also what their constraints are. What are things that are just hard to do in the current political climate, and how can we be helpful there?
One question I always like to ask, or the last question that I ask every interview is there an innovation outside of the GiveDirectly universe in the humanitarian space, or maybe outside of the cash transfer business, that you find particularly interesting or exciting?
I've talked a bit about internally, like we have our own learning agenda. So every year we're prioritizing a whole set of questions, ranging from questions about impact, like the Basic Income Project, to design, things like, using behavioral economics to design the structure of transfers, to things like implementations or basic questions like, should we cut out 3 of the steps in our process to make it faster, cheaper, and a little bit less secure, right? Like, what are those trade-offs? So we have internally a set of things we're doing. And I think last year, every dollar that we moved was part of at least one RCT or one test of this sort. So, for us, that kind of innovation isn't a separate bucket. It's just kind of a core part of what we're doing every year. I think externally, there's a lot of cool stuff happening. It can be distracting at times, right? There can be gadgets and sort of neat things that are, fun to give a TED talk about. But at the end of the day, it's high quality execution on stuff that's been proven to work that's really going to make a dent in poverty. So, we tend to get, I think, less focused on some of those other things happening outside. I think if there's a trend that I'm really excited about, it is sort of increased effort being put into performance measurement. So, we have our metrics that we publish to the website in real time. You can see, how many days did it take us to enroll a recipient, things like that. There are other people working on this as well. The IRC, for example, who we work with at Segovia, is doing a lot of exciting work to kind of define what would good performance look like in a humanitarian crisis. How do we measure that? And then how do we start improving that? And so I think moving towards that kind of performance measurement is the sort of broad trend that I'm most excited about outside of GiveDirectly.
I said that was my last question, but I have one more question for you, which is, how do you divide your time up? I know you've got Segovia, you've got GiveDirectly, you've got a number of other fellowships that you are a part of or work on. Do you divide your time amongst all of those, or do those all come back to a common core in some way?
Yeah, so Michael and I work together on GiveDirectly and Segovia, and I also do some academic work. I have an appointment at UCSD, and in that capacity, we do some work with the government of India on experimental evaluation of the impact of some of their reform agenda. Without a doubt, it's hard to get the right balance between all of those things, and it largely works because I'm working with great people and hopefully investing mainly in helping them succeed and not trying to do everything myself, which would be unrealistic. I do think that there has been an enormous amount of complementarity and overlap between those. What we learn in India, we can apply directly to what we do with GiveDirectly in East Africa. A lot of what we learned, at GiveDirectly was what helped motivate Segovia, because we just realized that the challenges that we were having at GiveDirectly in terms of getting integrated and getting payments out securely and safely were the same challenges that every international NGO faces when they're doing transfer programming. So the sitting at those boundaries is it's hard, but it does create this sort of incredible opportunity for learning and the exchange of ideas.
Paul, our time here has been short. I feel like there's another 2 hours we could talk, but I know that you've got to get on with your day. Thank you so much for being a guest here on the Terms of Reference podcast.
Stephen, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.